Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes for people to join. Very nice to have everybody joining us. We can't see people coming into the session because you're all anonymous this morning, so we're trusting that you are joining. Okay, I think we'll get started just so we don't have anyone sitting there in silence waiting for us. But welcome everybody. I'm so pleased that you can join us for this Aspiring Leaders webinar. I'm Anna Garde. I'm a principal consultant at Prospectus. Just to introduce myself, I've been very lucky to be recruiting great talent at Chief Executive, Director and Board level for the Beyond Profit sector for over 13 years now, including 2 of our brilliant speakers today. And by way of introduction to today's topic, as recruiters, we're often asked, how do we secure my first CEO role? And I love it. It's a great question for us. It allows us to support people's career journeys. It brings fresh thinking into organisations, and it allows us to increase, get my words out, increase inclusivity as well. So Prospectus recently shared some insights on this in an article that we shared on LinkedIn. And we also shared an article for organisations about how they can embrace the talent and brilliant opportunities of those stepping into their first CEO roles. And we had a really popular response to that. So that's led to this event today. So we can recover some of the recruitment advice, but essentially today is about 2 things. We want to help and advise you and inspire you to secure your first CEO role. And we want to make sure it's a successful transition. So we've drawn together an excellent panel to demystify this for you. I'm very lucky to have placed 2 of our brilliant speakers, Marcia Asaro, who is Executive Director of the Walcott Foundation, and Peter Greig, who is Chief Executive of Homestart UK. And we're also delighted to be joined by the brilliant Jane Ide, OBE, and CEO of Akivo, who brings brilliant experience of being the CEO herself 3 times, and also supporting lots of CEOs in their roles as well. So the format for today, shortly, we're going to ask our speakers to introduce themselves. Then we're going to pose questions to them, including some of the questions that some of you have already sent out in advance. But we are asking you to submit your questions throughout this session too, so that we can do a live Q&A. You should be seeing a Q&A function below our faces. So not the chat, but the Q&A function. This allows you to ask questions and remain anonymous, which is the focus for today. But just to let you know, we are recording this session. We've had some people say they can't join us, but they're really keen to hear. So this session will be recorded, but obviously will be completely anonymous for you. Now, any questions that we don't get to go through, we'll try and follow up with all of that later for you too. We're going to be hopefully sharing some resources as well, and we'll aim to wrap up by 10:30. So without further ado, it's plenty from me. I'm going to pass over to Marcia, Peter and Jane to introduce themselves. Marcia, shall we start with you?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Marcia. I'm the Executive Director here at the Walcott Foundation. We are a place-based foundation in South London, in Lambeth, and we give money away to low-income communities here. And previous to that role, I worked at City and Guilds Group running their corporate social responsibility work.
Thank you, Marcia. And Peter, I'll hand over to you.
Morning, everyone. I'm Peter Greig. I'm Chief Executive of Homestart UK. Homestart is a federation of charities that supports families. We train volunteers, and those volunteers lend emotional and practical support to families. I have been Chief Exec at Homestart since January 2020, so a few weeks before the pandemic. Always a good time to start your first CEO role. Prior to that, I was Director of External Affairs at the Children's Society and have worked in the children and families sector for quite a few years now. I don't know how long, but it's probably best not to think about it too hard.
Thanks, Peter. And last but not least, Jane.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm Jane Ide. I am Chief Exec of Akivo, which is the membership body for Chief Execs of voluntary sector and civil society organisations, charities across England and Wales. We have about 1,700 members. I am, as Anna said, in my 3rd Chief Exec role, but having said that, I've only been a Chief Exec for the last 6 years. I've only been in the sector for the last 6 years. So my previous history was very much at senior level roles in the communications and stakeholder engagement world in the public sector, in the NHS, in the civil service, and also a little bit in the private sector as well. So quite a mixed bag of history.
We're very lucky to have all three of you this morning, so thanks so much for joining us. We'll kick off with a couple of initial questions, just to sort of get people thinking about the questions they might want to submit, but also to get your great insights too. So Marcia, I'm going to start with you first. What is the best thing about being a CEO?
Well, I would say probably small pond, big fish. So lots of responsibility, which I love, and lots of challenge. But also, I love the responsibility, but I also see it as a kind of utter privilege. So there's that. I'd say also for me, I love the opportunity to kind of live out my worldview of leadership, which has been honed by those I love. And then lastly, I'd say passion. So my passion and specialism is around systems change and funding, which I won't bore you with, but every single day I get to be involved in that work, which is about changing lives. So
I love that. Oh, we lost you momentarily, Marcia, there, but I think we got everything you were wanting to say. And the passion for systems change, I think, is brilliant. Hopefully we'll hear more about your leadership style as well a little bit later too. So thanks for that. And Peter, what have you learned about navigating the CEO and chair relationship over the last few years?
Yeah, it's really interesting when you step up into your first chief exec role. I think the chair CEO relationship is the one that it represents probably the biggest leap from anything you've done before. So you might well have, I certainly had plenty of experience working with boards but never been responsible for that relationship before. And that sort of burden, maybe that's a bit of a negative word, but that weight of responsibility, I think, is critical. I have been fortunate in my career. I've always worked quite closely with other chief execs of the organizations I've worked with. And I've been able to observe chief execs that have got it really right with the chair's relationship, albeit differently. And I won't name who, and hopefully but I've also observed early on in my career somebody who did it spectacularly badly, and it very much erupted. So I learned from an early stage in my career how important that chair chief exec relationship is. And in terms of navigating it, to the question you asked, I think it's really important as a chief exec and that you spend the time to invest in that relationship with the chair and take it really seriously. I remember, so I can't remember exactly the ratios, but somebody said about a third of your time as chief exec should be on that board chair relationship. Jane will have better figures on all of that. And I don't know if I ever get it right or wrong in terms of the ratio, but it certainly does take a good deal of effort. And it should be a two-way relationship. You need to have a no surprises, honest, I mean, all that, everybody on the call know all of that. And just plugging Akivo for a minute, they do, and I'm sure Jane will say this, but they have a great course, which is called the Dynamic Duo. And if you get your chief exec role, you can go on that course with your chair and have a good conversation. So I've been really lucky. I've had two chairs at Home Start so far. Both brilliantly supportive, but quite different in terms of how I've managed it. I think my learning from the first chair was it took a while, I think, for me to learn how to be more assertive in that role. I was probably a bit passive. In anybody who knows me might not be surprised to hear that, but with the second chair, I think we've developed a slightly more proactive chair chief executive relationship. Both very supportive, both brilliant people, but I think I'm finding my stride in terms of strategically a bit better in the second one. So anyone out there wanting to be a chief executive, learn more about the chair and the board role. Watch different people, different styles. Some chief execs hold it really tightly and need to do that with the board. Some a bit hold it looser. And I think obviously you're going to have to find out what works for you and your organization. And just final quick point is that the chief exec and chair relationship, it doesn't sit in a vacuum. It sits within the context of the organization, yourself, your development, the chair's development, the trustee board, the economic context, and all these things. So there's no right or wrong answer, but hold it with trust and honesty and no surprises, I'd say, would be my thoughts.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Peter. I think that's really helpful, and really helpful to share your experience of having those two different chairs as well and the difference between the two. I think that's really important. Jane, what support network have you drawn on in your own CEO roles, and how can Akivo help with this too?
Well, I've been really fortunate that I've had, I think, really 3 key support networks since I stepped into a chief exec role. So the first one is a small group of women who are all leaders of similar organisations to the ones I have led. You know, so we met through work, we got to know each other by being in meetings together and so on. But we very quickly, or I very quickly found myself being almost adopted, if you like, into this group of women that had known each other for a while. And that has been fantastically supportive, because it's having a place where you can say the things you need to say, but you can't say to your chair, or that you can't say to your senior team, or you can't necessarily say to your family, and knowing that there's a sort of a shared wisdom and experience there. And, you know, we've all been in those situations, we've all been in those places, so everybody in that group is enormously supportive. I think the second network, similar but different in the sense that it came together for me actually through doing a leadership development program with Akivo before I came here as the chief exec. I was a member for 4 years before I started the role. And joining that leadership development program, which ran over 6 months, it was all done virtually. We still haven't met face to face. We're planning to get together after Christmas. But there were 3 or 4 of us that came together in particular sort of buddy groups within that, you know, structured as a way of getting to support each other. And we've just continued. This is 2.5 years later. And I think the sharing and the openness and the honesty that we had in those groups created some very deep, very strong relationships very, very quickly. So that's been really important for me as well. And the third one is actually my family, because I think it's easy to forget that when you're in a leadership role, particularly in this sort of sector or in the sort of pressures that we all work under in this sector, it's your family that bears the brunt of the long hours. It's your family that bears the brunt of you've had a really bad day with your chair and you just need to kick the cat or whatever it is you need to do. It's your family that kind of pays the price, actually, in many ways, for, you know, all the sacrifices and challenges that come with a leadership role in this sector. But at the same time, they are the ones that hopefully, you know, are absolutely right behind you. And that's certainly been my experience. And in all honesty, you know, it's a brilliant job to be in. I love being in this sort of role and I love working in this sector. But there have been times I would not have got through the last 6 years without one or other or all 3 of those support networks. So hugely important, I think, when you're in this sort of work.
I love that. And I love hearing about these sometimes ad hoc peer groups that pop up. And I also think that's just brilliant, because it is that need for support and getting it, people getting it in the places that sometimes they're not even expecting it. So thanks for that, Jane.
And I think, sorry, just to add to that, because you did ask about what Akivo can do for that. And, you know,
yeah.
This is what we do. We provide peer-to-peer support. We give people opportunities to connect with other leaders that they wouldn't necessarily get to meet, as I did through that professional development program. But it could be something as simple as posting a message on our community board and getting somebody replying, and then you have a phone call, and then all of a sudden you've got a new friend, you know, or meeting somebody at an event, whatever it might be. Because I think, you know, there are so many ways you can cross-cut our sector, whether it's to do with the scale of the organisation you're leading, or the type of organisation you're leading, or the geography, or where you are personally on your journey, whether you're a brand new chief exec or whether you're a very experienced chief exec. And all of that, you know, it really pays to tap into the networks that are out there and the people out there, because it's a hugely supportive environment. People really do want to support each other, because we all know, you know, that there but for the grace of God go us, and most of us have been in some of those situations ourselves. And there's also nothing new under the sun. There's very rarely we hear something from somebody that somebody else in our network hasn't already managed through, worked through, been supported through. So there's always somebody that you can turn to for help when you need it.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks, Jane. And I can vouch for the family support, having had a husband who's been doing an interim executive director role for a year. I'd like to think that I've been providing some support from the other side, but we'll have to ask him at some point, see what he thinks of that too. But no, thanks, Jane. And Marcia, I'm going to come back to you in terms of thinking now, what do you think helped you secure your first CEO role?
I would really like to say woke up, applied, walked into the role, and that was it. But actually it wasn't like that. I kind of want to start off by saying kind of right place, right time. But the right place and the right time for me was the culmination.
Oh, Marcia, we lost you just there for a moment. You were saying the right time, right place and the right time was
a culmination of a 2-year plan, kind of. And I want to say roughly and loosely, because obviously over the 2 years, life took over as usual, right? So had children, moved home, COVID happened, but nevertheless, and I think helped me to kind of focus on kind of positioning where I wanted to be, what I wanted to be doing. That plan, I kind of pulled out groups I wanted to kind of connect with. So yes, my tribe. So yes, different networks. Some free stuff. So some were just friends who kind of over those 2 years would help me with presentations. And there was one friend who constantly said to me, nobody wants to hear your life story, just ask questions. So, you know, friends like that, but also I had lots of paid support as well. So I had, you know, I had actually an amazing career coach who helped me rewrite my CV and LinkedIn so that it better reflected my experience, my values, and I think helped others to see where I might be a better fit. So lots of stuff like that. I mean, the other thing I want to touch on was the thing about the plan was it was not exact, but because it helped me to be much clearer about where I was trying to get to, even in the midst of the madness, to find small incremental things to do to keep me tracking along to that end and final point. So for example, when COVID hit, I was stuck at home on maternity leave with very young children, one that cried a lot. And instead of kind of a period that I think might have been super stressful, actually, what I did is I did lots and lots of learning, and I attended things I would never have had the chance to attend if they'd been face-to-face or in person in different time zones. And all of those things kind of together, you know, were part of me kind of being in the right place at the right time. So it was a journey for me. It was a journey. Yeah, a double journey, but nevertheless, it was a journey and a plan.
I love that, Marcia. The plan of 2 years, that's amazing. And just keeping motivated in those small pieces adding up to a really big outcome as well in terms of just your overall learning.
Yeah, because there is something about the kind of keeping your head in the game. And I'd say like I said, over the 2 years, life happened, but my head stayed in the game. Yeah. I stayed quite focused. And I may not have felt it at times, but when I look back now, actually, I can see I was quite focused, but I didn't always see.
But having that plan is amazing. I think that's really, really useful and just really helpful to share that journey, and particularly say the friends, but also the professional support, I think is just as important, isn't it? And really planning that out too. So no, that's brilliant. Thanks for that, Marcia. I'm going to come back to you, Peter, and ask which transferable skills have you used in the role that have most surprised you?
Oh, most surprised me. Well, I think songwriting and singing was one that surprised me. I sang a Christmas song for our Homestart network, which was a skill I didn't realize I had. Well, don't have actually, is to be frank, but it went down quite well. There's all sorts of skills to be a chief exec, and there's a question in the Q&A about, do you need a master's degree or anything else? I would hope that our sector is getting beyond the need for meaningless qualifications when you don't need them. Now, clearly, if you need one, you need it, and they can make that clear which one that is and why you need it. But on the whole, I think our sector is getting a bit better at recognizing and valuing experience, not just bits of paper. But that said, so the framework people ask me about, how do you make that step up into next level leadership roles, whether chief exec or sort of other director roles? And I often just use the illustration of upwards, sideways and downwards skills. Upwards, we've talked about a bit already. So how do you manage boards and decision makers and stakeholders around you that have a bearing and influence on what you need to try and achieve, how you get your vision through? And we've talked a bit about that already, but it's an obvious set of skills. If you don't have some of those to display and to talk about, then go and find them, go and get on a board for another charity, or go and volunteer for bits of outside your comfort zone work in your organization and just see what happens. You really need to show that in an interview. I think that you can do the upward stuff. The downward stuff is maybe more obvious in terms of leadership. I don't mean downwards in a pejorative sense, but downwards in terms of leadership, management of functions, of areas of work. And the obvious thing to say on that front is that all of us will come up through a journey, and some people's journey will be all over the place and some people's will be a bit cleaner in terms of a line. Now, on that journey, there's be plenty of things you picked up and there'll be plenty of things you haven't. So no two chief exec jobs are the same. So you really need to understand the organization and print up job descriptions, look at them all the time, try and understand the difference between the one role and another. And what you want to try and what I'd suggest people try to do is plug the gaps. So I came from a sort of policy, research, comms, campaigning route. And it meant that I didn't have so much operational experience and finance experience and HR experience. And so at the Children's Society, when I was there, I was trying to build that. And I'm really fortunate to have very supportive chief execs at the time who helped me understand that and look at that and see that and build those skills. So do that, find the bits that you don't have and build on those. You've got to be comfortable not being a specialist. You've got to just be a generalist across the board, really, as a chief exec. And so even if you've got a specialism, you've got to lay that down a little bit. I find that really hard thing to do sometimes. You want to dive in and get involved, but you can't in that level of detail. And then the final bit I'll just say on this skills piece, the sideways. We've talked a bit about peer groups and relationships, and I think that your skill to navigate with peers is an important skill to demonstrate and represent. In an organization, it's with your colleagues at the same level or your SLT or whatever it might be. But as a chief exec, I think to be able to demonstrate you can move with the sector, that you know the sector, that you understand the different organizations, and it's not necessarily networking, but actually you do have those peer groups of support. You recognize some of the trends, some of the challenges that are facing, because you need to be able to place in context the challenges that you see in your organization. Make sure that you're not overcorrecting if it's a sort of a sector-wide issue, and have that radar in that sense. So that's my answer to the question: upwards, sideways, and downwards blend of skills and stuff like that.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thanks, Peter. And something, as you say, I think recognising where those gaps are, practically addressing them. Trustees, as you mentioned, is a brilliant way to do that. Trustee positions to just look at things from a different angle, really get that strategic overview as well, and that leadership piece too. So thanks for that. That's brilliant. Jane, I'm going to ask you a controversial question. Do you think it's a myth that the CEO role can be lonely? And does that depend on your senior team and your board?
No, it's not a myth, and yes, it does sometimes. I think my simple answer to that. So I think it can be lonely. It can be isolating. It can be quite challenging. There's no question that if you're going to step into a role like this, you have to be aware that you are, if you think of the old-fashioned egg timers, you know, with the sand drop, with the pinch point, you've got your board on one side, you've got your staff and potentially volunteers on the other side, and you have to be there for all of that. You have to hold all of that together. You have to be able to look in both directions at all times, so you get a real crick in your neck. And particularly if things are difficult for whatever reason, that can be a very lonely place. And that, I think, goes back to what I was talking about earlier, and some of what Peter and Marcia have talked about as well, about how you make sure you've got those networks around you to support you. It's not always like that because you've got a problem with your board, or because you've got a problem with your exec team. But if you have got a challenge there, then that exacerbates it, and you do have to find the ways to manage it. Fortunately, I know from my own experience and certainly from within our network, it's rare to have both falling apart at the same time, because that is a very, very difficult. I've seen it happen a couple of times, and it is a very, very difficult situation to navigate. But I think it comes back to, it's partly what Peter said earlier about investing the time in those relationships. And Yes, I think it's absolutely crucial. Invest the time with your chair and your board. Each individual mistake I made quite early on in my first role was, or not a mistake, but something I didn't do early on in my first role was actually get to know each individual trustee on an individual basis and understand where they were coming from, what their key priorities were, why were they in this role? And I realised a little bit later down the line how much I could have achieved more if I'd have known all those sorts of things. You can only move at the speed of trust. And so the more you invest in those relationships, the better. The same is absolutely true of your senior team. And, you know, I suspect everybody on this call will be in a senior role in whatever context they're working in now, or will certainly be heading in that direction. And therefore, you'll know from the other side what it's like if your chief exec or your leader doesn't invest in that relationship with you, and what a difference it makes if they do. So it really pays to pay attention to those things. Probably it's a real challenge, because I think in the chief exec role, you know, there's an expectation and there is a reality that actually what you are there to do, amongst other things, apart from hold the reins and manage all the operations and make sure the boat doesn't sink and look after all these relationships, is you've got to be out there and you've got to be the face of the organisation, and you've got to be engaging with stakeholders and funders and beneficiaries and all the rest of it. And actually it's all of that, and it's a constant juggling act. But the foundations, you know, that will cause you to really wobble will be those key relationships. So it's absolutely worth prioritize them early, understand where the challenges might be, do whatever. It's like everything about our role is about risk and mitigation ultimately. So understand where the challenges might be or the risks might be in those relationships. Do what you can to mitigate those early, whatever that might mean. And sometimes that does mean having to make some hard choices, and can mean that, you know, very much so for people in the chief exec role, and then work from there.
Yeah, I think that's really, really sound advice, Jane. And I see a lot of CEOs who are successful in their roles do that very early on, and get out and about and meet all those key stakeholders as well. Marcia, I'm going to come back to you. What's been your biggest surprise in the role?
I think probably the role. I'm really surprised every day here that I feel like every single thing I've done in my life is relevant to this job. My home life, my volunteering, every single thing. And I probably every day could from one of those three things. I didn't know that was going to come in handy down the line. I'd say, yeah, definitely that practical nature of the role. And things like, yes, 20% of the things that are on my desk, 3% of the time. And there's a need to kind of find, to know, you know,
Marcia, we're losing you a bit, and I don't want to lose your sage advice. Should we try camera off and see if that helps?
Yeah, let's try that.
I'm sorry to not see your face, but you were just saying that 20% of the...
Yes, yes, really, 20% of the things on my desk really do take up 80% of my time. So that's quite surprised. But I wanted to share one of my newest bits of learning, which I found very surprising. I only learned about 2 weeks ago, which is in this role, there is a kind of unusual, special nature in the role, where you get to have this helicopter view of all the moving parts. And I've realised, I can see how it works in the organisation, but actually in the conversations, even with our trustees who are very specialist in the skills they bring, that brings a real advantage. In all the discussions that we're having, because I get to see all of the moving parts, almost the golden thread. I don't want to say I'm the holder of the golden thread, but yeah, I get to see all of those parts, and I'd say actually right now, that's the biggest surprise of how unique that is and how kind of important it is to kind of responsibly.
Yeah. No, I completely see. We've got some good analogies here. We've got the holder of the golden thread. We've got the egg timer being in the middle. This is good. I like it a lot. And thanks for coming back on camera. It did help, Marcia, so that's much appreciated, even though we couldn't see you. But that's brilliant. And Peter, coming to you again, how do you unwind?
Yeah, so there's some questions in the chat as well about having children and combining responsibilities of caring with CEO. I have 2 young children, 9 and 10. So one of the ways that I like to unwind is just spending time with family, which is not necessarily unwinding, but you know what I mean. I've always liked to have at least a bit of exercise in the week. I remember a couple of chief executives I've worked with being really absolutely obsessed with exercise. I'm nowhere near that, but I do like to carve out an hour or 2 for football each week. It helps me unwind and just have a bit of a break. And I think the other point, I mean, no one really cares how I unwind, but the point I would say as a chief executive, one of the important things that you must be role modeling, you must be showing what you think the organization should be like. And I know that's so much easier said than done, but if you're the sort of person that works all hours and never takes a break and sends emails at all hours of the day, everything else, it will rub off on the whole organization. And as much as you think it is urgent, it often is urgent, but it's often isn't as well. So we've been experimenting. In previous organizations, we tried something, putting, you know, that strap line you put at the bottom of your emails. These are my working hours, might be different than yours. I'm sending this email because it suits me, but don't expect a response. And it's remarkable how small acts like that of role modeling better work-life balance can make a big difference. And I think if you can do that as chief executive and help the organization to do that, I think it's, you know, much better for everyone's mental health and well-being.
I like that. I think that's it, isn't it? It's mental health well-being, which the sport is really good for as well. All those sort of things are really helpful. I think particularly post-pandemic, where has been easy for people to stay at their desks, carrying on working well into the evening. No, thanks, Peter. That's really helpful. And I'm going to ask all three of you this question. How would you advise a CEO prepares for their role? Jane, I'll come to you first.
Well, I suppose the first thing is, from personal experience, I didn't prepare to come into this. You know, it's been quite interesting listening, you know, especially listening to Marcia talking about her plans and having that sort of touch point all the way through everything else that life is happening, because I came into this by accident. And so I suppose there's something about actually being prepared for an opportunity that comes out of nowhere. And if that's something that speaks to you, then just go for it. But I think there's obviously some practical preparation for stepping into a role like this. And I think Peter touched on it earlier about getting comfortable with the bits that you're uncomfortable with, you know, so be honest with yourself about, for me, a bit like Peter, financial management, operational management, not my area. And nail the comms bit, no problem whatsoever. So be clear about that. And we do actually have at Akiva, we have a set of leadership principles that I'll put the link in the chat in a moment that you can have a look at and work through and see where your strengths and less strong points are. But I think there's also the personal side. And again, this is not something I did before I stepped into the chief exec role for the first time, but with hindsight, you know, had somebody told me this is what I was going to be doing, I think invest in your own resilience. Work out where your pressure points are and how you're going to deal with them, because they will come. There is no question about that. I think about your networks and who is going to support you, and who do you need to develop some new ones? And I don't mean that in a manufactured way, but you know, who do you think you might need to get to know, and how can they help you? Definitely think about getting a mentor. Very, very important when you've got, and it doesn't have to be a formal arrangement, but having somebody that you can talk to and say, oh my God, is it really like this? And they say, yeah, it's really like this, but it's okay, you'll survive, is incredibly helpful. For some people, having a coach, either in the run up, you know, there's different roles for coaching, that whole sort of career planning, preparation for interview and application process, and then obviously once you're in the role. But I suppose the one thing above all else, which is easy to forget, is be authentic, because I think in these sorts of conversations, we talk a lot about how you get into a role like this, how you take on, and clearly people have got really, really strong aspirations, which is fantastic. But it's like the difference between a wedding and a marriage. You know, you can work flat out, you can get the job, you're in there, you've landed, and then all of a sudden it feels wrong. You don't want to be there. You're not happy. You're not the right person for that organisation. You may actually cause harm ultimately by being the wrong person for that organisation, and it's no good for you or for them or for the courts. Whereas if you are authentic and you are clear about who you are and what you bring to this, then the right opportunity will match that, and it makes for a much happier marriage and a much longer lasting one, which is what we need for the whole sector.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Thanks, Jane. We give a lot of advice of be yourself in a presentation, show your vision, because if they select that vision, that's great. But actually, if not, then you weren't the right fit. So I completely agree with that. Thank you. Marcia, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just kind of leaning off of your be authentic. So for me, the other thing about kind of being authentic is, what is the thing you really love? Because this thing about the marriage or the wedding, I think that is actually, I utterly love my role, but I love what I'm doing. I often, when I meet people, I say I work, I'm the executive director. So I think there's something about finding what you love, leaning into what you love. We spend so much time at work, find what you love. The other thing about I think it's about mentoring and things like that. So look, what I would say is personal development is always worth it. That sense of self-awareness, honing your kind of emotional intelligence skills, they are just good for you to be a leader of yourself first before you become a leader. So I think that's hugely important. And I want to say, don't be put off by what you can't afford to do. You know, I have a whole list, a lifetime of accessing every possible bursary that was available to me. In fact, I couldn't have done my master's without that. But yes, I just want to also say, I don't think you need a master's in this day and age to do this role. I just want to clarify that myth. And can I just add on to your last one around building your tribe? Hugely important. And Jane, you said you may need to expand, you may need new networks. I utterly agree with that, because the thing about new networks for me, it's networks where you kind of can mentally spar with people, where you can do, I nourish and cheer each other on, build your tribe.
Brilliant. Thanks, Marcia. And I can see Jane's popped that link in as well. So that's brilliant. Thanks, Jane. And how about for you, Peter?
I'm not sure if anybody can see it, Anna, because I don't seem to have.
Oh, don't worry. If we can't, we're going to share resources at the end. So we'll make sure that gets out. Thanks, Jane. Yeah, Peter, what about you? Would you add anything else to that too?
I thought the points that colleagues made were amazing, and I 100% agree with that point about authentic fits. If it's not for you, then it's not the right thing, and you won't do well in the role and the organisation. So just to add to it, I guess the thing I read in one of the questions was about trying for a few chief exec roles and not getting them. I thought I'd just say a little bit about that, because I think that's important. I think, you know, if you're lucky, you'll get the first one you go for, and you get it, and it's all sweet and it's rosy and everything else, but more likely you won't. So I'd gone for a chief exec role prior to the one that I got and didn't get it, but I got really close. I got really much closer than I thought I would do, if I'm honest. But then once you get close, it's sort of, in a way, you prefer that you hadn't got anywhere near it, don't you, sometimes? But coming second is rubbish, isn't it, in a race? But it was right that I didn't get it, absolutely right. And I was sort of wrestling with that particular role, and particularly how do I talk, because it's an internal role, how do I talk to colleagues about it? Do I share that I'm going for it when people are asking, and if they're assuming that you might, and all these things? Do I talk about this openly? Do I hold it to myself? And actually, you know, don't go on about it. No one wants to hear about it too much. But I think that you talking about your vision for why you might want, not that you want to be a CEO because it's a nice thing to have in your job title or a salary lift or anything like that, but why is it that you want the role? What is it you're trying to achieve? And if you can talk about that a bit, and start getting it into your mind. It actually is those little, it used to be the moments on the train or the bus, but I guess nowadays it's the moments down the stairs or whatever when you're going for a cup of tea. But those little moments you've got to think about it and actually be working it through in the cogs of your mind, that you might be one day a chief executive and what that might look like and feel like in different contexts. I think that's quite important. So I would recommend talking about it with colleagues, but obviously people will feel differently about that, and in some environments it might be easier to do that than others. So like, talk about it, build those contacts that you can talk about it with. And one other quick point is, I think we all get a bit obsessed with our own organizations and what leadership looks like and what chief executives are like, and we get this sort of we've all got a they in their lives, and they won't let us do this and they won't let us do that, and you think when you're lower down in an organization you think it's the chief executive, and then when you get a bit nearer you think it's the board, and then probably when you're on the board you think it's someone else. I don't know, there's always a they, isn't there? But I wonder, like, I think it's really helpful to break that perspective of they being a personal issue or problem or challenge or whatever, and try and see some other versions of it. Try and get some broader perspective on how organizations work. And I think that would be really valuable when you go into your own chief exec job.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter. And thanks for sharing that journey. Actually, I think that's really important, isn't it? That internal situation too. We're going to come to some questions we've had in advance of today, and I can see they're coming thick and fast today as well. So we'll be going through those too. But I'm going to come to you, Marcia, particularly picking up on what you said about your own journey and having had children recently to before you becoming a CEO and being on that plane, because we've had a question about, can you balance a young family with being a charity chief executive, and do sacrifices have to be made?
So could I firstly say, I just want to disagree with Peter's earlier idea.
Controversial.
Peter's earlier idea that at home with the children, that's relaxing time. No,
Depends on the age.
Not always. So I've got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. The 3-year-old's just turned 3. And what I would say is, it is possible. Look, you know, when we're talking a lot about leadership today, but in my head, I think to myself, well, what does a leader really look like? We all look really, really, really different, and we want that, right? So it is possible, and I absolutely want to say that. But what I do think you have to do is, I think you have to be very, very boundaried. And I'd say to you that's quite difficult to do, but it is possible. So a couple of things. So for me is, I'm in the office quite early, because I've always worked really early. That's not because of this role. So I'm in the office between 6:30 and 7, but at 4 o'clock I am out the door. Nobody asks any questions at 5 to 4 because I'm out the door, because I have to be. I've got lots of support. So I've got lots of support at home, parents' help and so on and so forth. I do have, so things like here, I have 16 evening meetings I have to attend across the year. So I tend to keep that day in my diary. So when there isn't a meeting, if I want to attend something of an evening, that's the day I would choose. So I have to be very, very organised. But what's the other side of that? The other side of that is, but life happens. Kids, not straightforward. So you do get kids being sick and having to, yesterday, in fact, I came into the office, I was here for 2 hours, and then I had to cycle back home to take my daughter to the doctor. So the other side of that is, you also have to be able to have that flexibility. I'm coming from another organisation with really good culture around not just flexible working, but kind of work-life balance. And that's something as I've come here, I've just know that's really important. That's important for me, and that's important for the team that I work with here. So yeah, boundaried, very organised on one hand, but on the other hand, understand that you have to be able to have some flexibility to do the things you need to do. And in my case, it's kids, but in for those of you who are listening, in your case, it may be other things, other things will pull in your time.
Yeah, completely agree, Marcia. And I think it goes back to what Peter was saying about that culture and demonstrating that leadership, doesn't it? About we support people to have lives outside of work. I think that's really relevant. Jane, I'm going to come to you with this question. How can I demonstrate for the CEO role a competency when my career path hasn't been a straight line? For example, been in different sized organisations, I've been a consultant. What are your thoughts on that, Jane?
I think it can be a challenge, and it's a challenge I'm very familiar with, because I mentioned at the beginning of the call, you know, I haven't come through what some people would think is a traditional route, you know, through the sector, you know, starting at a less senior level, working my way, always worked in the sector and so on. I came through a very varied path, so to speak, where I took lots of left turns and lots of right turns, and went and did something completely different, and took some time out for family caring responsibilities, and then came back and then did something else again. And I remember having a conversation actually with a recruiter, I don't think it was you, Anna, but a few years ago when I was applying for a role, and they sort of said, just explain your CV to me, Jane. And suddenly the penny suddenly dropped, that what they meant was they couldn't see what the thread was. You know, we were talking about golden threads, the golden thread. And I realised that what I needed to do was actually explain something that to me was completely intrinsic, which was that everything I'd ever done was about relationships, engagement, communication, persuasion, campaigning, advocacy, all of those things, all of which were things that were really valuable in the role that I was going for and in the sector that I was going for. So I think the first thing is, it goes back to, if you can see a role that's there on offer, and you really feel, having done all your research and talked to as many people as you can and trying to dig under the reality, because trust me, every chief exec role, every organisation is not quite what it looks like in the recruitment. But when you've done all of that and you really feel that this is something that's calling to you, and it's one that you feel you can do a great job, as if you don't, you know, don't even go there. Then you have to work out what it is about your story that is unique and special and gives that interview panel something that they're not going to get from somebody else. And that's fairly classic interview preparation in some ways, but it's really true. And I think, again, it also goes back to, in fact, I was having exactly this conversation with somebody only earlier this week who is in the process of applying for their dream job. And he said to me, you know, same as Peter sort of said earlier, you know, I'm really strong in these areas, but this bit I'm not so good at. And I said, well, be clear with them about that. Be clear that you know that you haven't got every top box ticked. No candidate's going to have every box ticked, but be clear that you have thought about this, you've understood what those challenges are, and you have a plan for addressing it, because that's actually how you model chief exec behaviour. We all go into a board meeting or a meeting with our senior team or whatever it is thinking, oh, I don't know, we're going to get through this, but we're going to get through it somehow, and here's the plan for dealing with it. It goes back to what I said about mitigating risk earlier. So I think that's the really key thing, is be honest with yourself about where your development areas might be, work out how you're going to address them, and be clear with people that that's what you're going to do.
Yeah, I think that's really relevant, isn't it? And really important too. So thanks, Jane.
Sorry, can I also just say, Anna, just in case you don't pick it, there was one question which I think is relevant to this about faking it till you make it.
I was going to be coming to that. That's a great question.
Yes. Oh, well, we'll come back to that in a moment.
We'll come back to that. I've got one final one for Peter. But no, I think that's a brilliant question. So well done there. But Peter, just to pick up on another question we've had in, how do you evidence having strong connections in a new sector when you've had these in the past, but you haven't been able to network recently?
Yeah, I don't really know is the answer, but I think the when you go into an interview, I think what typically it'll be a board interviewing you, right? A chair perhaps, and maybe a few trustees interviewing for the chief exec role. What they're trying to do is work out whether you know what the sector's doing, that you have some contacts you can draw upon, that you're bringing to the table some sort of book of contacts, because you know it's probably not the only reason they're employing you, but it would be good to know that you do come with some of those contacts. So how can you demonstrate it? Well, I guess first of all, you can some people do this well and some people do it badly. Only do it if it's authentic. But you get out and about in the weeks before your interview. Go to sector events, go to Akiva events and other sector events, or whatever the relevant part of the industry is that you've got a job going for, and just be aware of what conversation's going on and be able to thread that into some of your answers. So you don't need to say, oh, and I know this person at this organization. That would be quite a blunt way to do it. But you say, oh, just the other day I was talking to X at the conference, or I was listening to da, 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 and I just think bringing that into your answers in an interview would be helpful. Then the second thing is, do get out and about and make some of those contacts. And what you'll find, I think, with chief execs and senior people in charities, they're really open to having a chat. So if you say you're going for a chief exec at an animal charity, and you don't really know how to make the jump or whatever, phone someone up that you might know who works in another animal charity and say, any chance of getting a chat with this person? And I'm sure they'll say yes. And even just get in touch with them directly on LinkedIn and say, I'd love a bit of your wisdom. I think chief execs love giving a bit of wisdom out, which is why probably we're going on too long this morning. So I do that. And just the final bit, look, I don't think it boils down, whether you get the job or not, it's not going to boil down to your contacts and whether you can evidence you network enough. But I think Marcia has made the point really well. Demonstrate how you build that wider piece into your calendar, into your diary, into your thinking. To say that I put aside this amount of time per year to make sure I'm out and about. I read these journals or these magazines just to make sure, and I listen to these podcasts. Just make sure you can say some of that and have an answer to it. But I don't think you have to go and make up contacts and just for the sake of the interview.
I agree. No, that's brilliant. Thanks, Peter. And we've got lots of questions coming in. So we're trying to fill those all, but one of the ones that just stand out for me is the same that stood out for you, Jane. I'm going to ask all three of you this. Would you be able to share a fake it until you make it moment with us today, please? I'm going to start with you, Jane, as you were so keen to leap in.
Every single board meeting, if I'm honest. I mean, and I've been, I worked it out, I've probably done about 24, 25 board meetings now. I'm just about starting to get to the point where I don't feel completely paralyzed with fear before I go into each one. But it's taken time, and actually the transformative thing in that for me was actually becoming a trustee and now a chair, because all of a sudden you see it from the other side and you realise that people aren't really there trying to pull the rug and question you on things that you don't really know about and all the rest of it, but that's what it feels like. So I think there is definitely an element of that it's entirely part of the job to feel, and it's like somebody else asked about imposter syndrome. I wouldn't go quite that far for me personally, but definitely that sense of I don't really know it all, but sometimes you have to look like you do, because that's part of what leadership sometimes entails. Not always, but sometimes.
I like that a lot. Having had a husband going through his first board meeting recently, I completely understand that. I kept saying, every chief executive goes through this. Don't worry, this is normal. How about for you, Marcia?
I'm disappointed because I don't know. I think I'm someone who, I know people that find this very strange, but I'm actually an introvert, and I spent many years really struggling, going to networks, meeting people, learning to be a leader. But I probably about 5 years ago, I think lots of different things that kind of I'm not quite comfortable with who I am now. It doesn't mean when I go, I think everything little like so if Jane, you're at 23, I'm like I'm perhaps 4 board meetings in within the first 6 months. Maybe 7 committees, something. And for me, in all of those contexts, so whether I'm going to a board meeting or whether I'm going to have a meeting with our fund manager, I just try to be super prepared. And there's something about the focus on the work takes me how I feel out of it. Doesn't mean I might not be critical after, oh, why didn't I ask this? But I don't in the same way, because I just try to focus on the work, and in some way, shape or form that just gets me through. And then look round, the meeting's over, and I can relax and chill. So sorry, it's a bit disappointing, but yeah, I don't have it in the same way, or maybe it's just I myself a bit just focused on the work.
No, I love that, Marcia. And I think even touching on the imposter syndrome, you wouldn't believe some of the people who tell me they have imposter syndrome. And my jaw just sort of hits the floor. And I'm like, really? You? How is that even possible? So no, I think that's totally true and good to have touched on too. Peter, how about for you?
I want to make an attempt to reframe this imposter syndrome question and say it's less a case of any of us are imposters, but more a case. And I think I saw this early on in my career working with some quite senior politicians, that everybody's making it up as they go along, everybody. And the quicker you realize that, the quicker you can move beyond this imposter syndrome framing, because it's less a case of any of us we all deserve to be in the roles we're in, right? We have made the case. So whoever we need to make the case, we're not imposters. There is a principle which is not named after me, I hope, called the Peter principle, which is that people get promoted beyond their level of competence because they just keep moving up a ladder, but at some point they're beyond their level of competence. So, but I don't think that's fair. So let's assume that we're all in a role because we deserve to be there. Then the question is, how do you handle that? And when I thought I knew what the when I got this job, I didn't think I knew what a chief exec role would look like. And then I started it, and then the pandemic kicked off. And then I was even surer that I had no idea what a chief exec role looks like. And so all this talk about, 30% of your day on this and that and this, it's sort of, I mean, I'm sure it's a good framework, but it's sort of nonsense because you do what you need to do in the moment. And in the pandemic, that's a bit different than elsewhere and everything else. So what I would say, so I've had plenty of moments where I feel vulnerable. I've had plenty of moments, well, every day. In fact, when we had a pre-call for this conversation, the first thing we all said to each other is that we all feel like we're sort of just making it up as we go along. And I think hold on to that and be, I don't be too flippant with it, perhaps, but recognize a vulnerability in the role and share that vulnerability, share the fact that you've made mistakes, share the fact that, you don't know all the answers. In fact, it's good leadership that you don't know all the answers. It'd be awful if you thought you did. So make a virtue of that and try and be humble in all your roles would be my approach to that question. But yeah, every day. I rarely say that I'm a chief executive. I usually if I meet someone in a whatever occasion, I would often, they say, what do you do? I work for a charity. I don't wear, but some people might wear this chief exec thing on their sleeve, but I find it quite I don't really. But anyway, that's just me, but that's a response to the question.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks, Peter. I can't believe we have almost run out of time. That's been brilliant this morning. I just think all of you have brought such amazing insights and advice, and hopefully that's been really helpful for everyone. So thank you for that to our speakers. Thank you also for all the great questions. I'm hoping that we've covered quite a lot of them in the conversations, but just to say, we're going to be sending around quite a lot of resources after this, including the article we've written, Jane's resources as well. So we will do our best to follow up with those, but we hope in the meantime it's been really educational and helpful too. Just to say, for anybody who's on this journey, we're also Prospectus are really happy to have confidential conversations, see where we can support you as well. That's what we're here to do. And yeah, just wanted to reiterate that from my point of view, Jane, Peter, Marcia, that's been fantastic and really enjoyable. I massively appreciate your honesty and your candidness and your advice, because I think there's been a huge learning there this morning, which is brilliant. So thanks, everybody. Have a fantastic day. We'll let you get away on time, and hopefully we'll see people in various guises very soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good luck.
Good luck. Yes.
Bye-bye.